Welcome to RISE Learning Machines seminars. I am Olof Mogren, and I'm a researcher on foundational and applied machine learning at RISE. RISE is Sweden's public research institute, and this is our open weekly seminar on AI and machine learning. This meeting will be recorded. Let us know if you want to be removed, and do check out the collection of great talks on our YouTube channel. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce Mélisande Teng, who is a PhD student at MILA and University of Montreal. She's under the supervision of Joshua Benjo, Hugo Larochelle, and David Rolnick. And her research interests are in machine learning and remote sensing for biodiversity monitoring, working on bird and butterfly species distribution modeling, and carbon storage quantification. And with this said, I will hand over the word and the screen sharing to you, Mélisande.
Thank you, Olaf, and thanks for the introduction. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk for the RISE Learning Machine seminars. Today, I will talk about species distribution modeling using remote sensing and citizen science data, which has been one of the major focuses of my PhD so far. So yeah, as Olaf said, I'm Mélisande Teng. I'm starting my 5th year of PhD here in Montreal in Quebec, Canada. And yeah, most of my work has revolved around AI and remote sensing, whether this is using drone imagery or satellite imagery or passive acoustic monitoring for biodiversity monitoring. And one thing I also like doing is drawing comics. So,
Mélisande?
yes.
Can you see if you can do full screen on the slide?
Oh, how is it showing now?
It is showing nicely, but we see the sort of the window of the browser window.
Okay.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
Perfect. Perfect.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I think I will try to monitor the chat, but if there's like any pressing clarification question, Olaf, please interrupt me.
Sure.
All right. So the problem that I'm really interested in is filling gaps in biodiversity data. So climate change is a major driver of biodiversity loss, which in turn impacts ecosystem services on which we rely on, like food and access to clean water and human health and so on. And the thing is that there are a lot of places for which we actually don't have any information about which species are found there. And they're usually the places where, well, extinction risk is highest. So South America and Australia and so on. So when you look at the data that we have on biodiversity, for example, if you look at the map on the top right of the screen, these are bird observations, reports, locations from eBird, which is a citizen science database that I'm going to talk about later. But you can already see here that it is very biased towards North America and Europe, because that's where most people go to do bird watching. But even in places where it seems that these places are well sampled and well surveyed, if you zoom in, for example, if you look at Massachusetts, which is the map at the bottom, you can actually see that no, we don't have data in many places, and most of the observation reports for birds observations are located alongside roads or in cities, which makes sense because that's mostly where people are. So why is it so important to fill, gaps in biodiversity data? Well, if you want to be able to take action and guide conservation policies, then it is important to understand what the current state of biodiversity is and understand where species are found in order to guide conservation decisions. So of course, well, I do research in computer science and deep learning, but ecologists have not waited until deep learning was there to try and tackle this problem. And there's this whole field which is called species distribution modeling, which is what ecologists do to try to understand the distribution of species. Basically, what they try to do is to describe the relationship between environmental conditions and actual or potential species presence. So typically, the environmental conditions are variables like precipitation or temperature, and then you also have access to species observations, and what they try to do is like kind of bring all these maps together and view the species distribution either in environmental space or projecting it back into geographic space. So most of these models actually assume that with the right variables, you can model the species distribution using environmental data. Now, I want to make a quick note on two terms that are important to distinguish. There are two things that are usually important when you look at species distribution modeling, and these are understanding geographic range and habitat of species. So those are two different things because, for example, if you take the rock pigeon, the range of the rock pigeon in Canada is the south of Canada and the west coast because it's too cold up north. But that doesn't tell you whether if you go to a specific place, you're going to see a pigeon. That just tells you like broadly geographically where the species can be found. On the other hand, the habitat is where all the environmental conditions meet for it to be suitable for species to develop. So for pigeons, those are cliffs, whether they're natural or artificial, like buildings and things like structures underneath bridges, and so on. On the other hand, you can also have species that have the same habitat, but different ranges. So if you look at the western bluebird and the eastern bluebird, they kind of look a bit similar and they have the same habitat, but they are never found together in the same place because, well, one of them lives on the west coast and one of them on the east coast of North America. So one reason it's important to make this distinction is that when you look at habitat mapping, you might usually want to have a finer resolution than geographic range because species that have a narrow habitat are more likely to be more affected by climate change because then it makes it harder for them to move across places to find habitats that are suitable if they need a very, very specific habitat. There are several challenges that are associated with traditional species distribution modeling methods. And first of all, they focus on narrow sets of species or geographical areas. So, I mean, it's quite easy to understand why narrow geographical areas might be a limitation, but if you just try to model a single species, I mean, that is really interesting if you're looking at a specific species in a given location, like to guide local policy. But if you want to do a more global mapping at scale, then you might be interested in looking at joint species distribution modeling instead, because species interact. So you can view it as if you know the distribution of a certain species, that might be informative for predicting the distribution of other species because there are prey-predator interactions, for example. However, traditional SDM methods often focus on cannot handle modeling many species at once. And the other main challenge in traditional SDM methods in ecology is the limited availability of the data. So I mentioned that traditionally people use environmental data, but it's often only available at a quite coarse resolution. But as I've mentioned, if you want to look at specific habitats, 1 kilometer resolution might not be enough. Secondly, the species data that is used often comes from field surveys, but it's actually quite costly to send people out everywhere to collect data. So ideally, what we'd like to have is scalable joint species distribution modeling at a fine resolution. That is, of course, fine resolution is kind of dependent on what kind of application you have, but like we definitely want something that could work at resolutions that are finer than 1 kilometer. So this is where we actually identified an opportunity in using machine learning, remote sensing, and citizen science for species distribution modeling. Why machine learning? Because, well, like with all the recent advances, we thought, okay, machine learning could be quite good at picking up multi-species interactions and also, processing a lot of data. Remote sensing is available everywhere. And so in our case, we looked at satellite imagery. And you can think that if you have satellite imagery information, actually, there must be some indication of what kind of habitat is there, because, well, at least you can see the trees that are there, the kind of land cover and so on. And satellite imagery is like, available everywhere at no cost with all these open programs like Landsat and Sentinel. So this is really great. And in order to tackle the challenges associated to limited field survey data, we thought, okay, how about we take citizen science data, which are basically data that you or I can collect, and it's usually very, very rich and available in more places than what you would have for field surveys. So with all this introduction and why I'm interested in this problem of filling gaps in biodiversity data, I'm going to talk about one project that we did to try and start to tackle this problem. And I'm going to present SatBird, which is a data set for bird species distribution modeling using remote sensing and citizen science data. This was presented at NeurIPS in the Dataset and Benchmarks track in 2023, last year. So, first of all, I should mention that the reason why we looked at birds is because there is a lot of bird data out there. And in order to kind of test this, if your framework, is promising or not, maybe you should, try in the places where at least you have the data for it to see, okay, is this a good framework? If it is, then maybe, there's more effort that can be done on data collection and so on. So our contributions with SatBird have been to propose and frame a task for predicting bird species encounter rates jointly for hundreds of species at a time at a given location using satellite images and environmental data as input. And we introduced SatBird, a data set for this task, and I'm going to present it a bit later. And we also benchmarked a variety of models on this data set. So let's first go into where the data comes from, which is the citizen science database called eBird, that I'm going to present quickly. So eBird is a large database at high spatial and temporal resolutions where anyone actually can upload observation records, which are called checklists in eBird. And a location where a checklist is recorded is called a hotspot, because usually, obviously, people never go at the exact same latitude and longitude, but a hotspot is, it would be, for example, okay, this pond in this park, and that's like, considered a hotspot because multiple people would go to the same place, and so the observations will be associated to the same location. What is really interesting about eBird is that it has presence-absence data. Most of the time when people report data in citizen science, it's quite opportunistic. So a lot of people, if, for example, if you use iNaturalist, you will go out there and take a picture, but then that's just gives you and identifies species that is there, but that gives you the species that is present, but you don't know anything about the species that are absent. Whereas in eBird, there's this option to submit complete checklists, which basically correspond to reporting everything that you saw and were able to identify on that day. So anything that you have not reported can be considered as absent, well, at least at the moment that you were, birding. And the important thing is that when you submit complete checklists, your primary purpose for the trip has to be birding. So this ensures a kind of high quality data. And there is also a data validation process in eBird, which, for example, will flag report species that are usually not found in certain places, and then this will be like manually verified.
A question.
Yes.
The absence data, isn't that very challenging to use in that sense? I mean, there could be a bird species one day, and then the next day we don't see it in that particular location. It doesn't mean it never goes there.
Yeah, exactly. So this is why it's important to have, multiple checklists and observations to kind of have to be able to average that over like time. Well, usually, a season is good enough because people are interested in breeding and non-breeding season. But it is true that there is, even though this is as reliable as field surveys, because that's what people would do out in the field, would be, to go to a place and stay there for a certain amount of time. But there is no such thing as like true absence, because a bird might be hiding or something. But we still consider that this is reliable enough, and that is the best we can have. But yeah, absence is definitely challenging. There are like a lot of methods in ecology that are developed for presence only data, where absence will be there will be things that will be like people will create pseudo absences for certain species in places where they haven't observed them explicitly. But of course, you actually never have ground truth absence when you use presence only data. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And so that is also gonna continue answering the question. So in our case, what we looked at is, so you have those species checklists where you say, okay, I've seen this, I haven't seen that, blah blah blah. But it's kind of a 1-0 binary thing. But as you said, one checklist is not enough to represent whether a species is there or not. So the quantity that we were interested in modeling is actually bird species encounter rates, which is the probability that if you go to a certain place, you're going to see the species. And that can be obtained by, averaging many checklists together. So in our case, what we want to do is to use satellite imagery, and then from an image of the place, like predict what is the probability that you're gonna see a certain species. So this is a supervised multi-output regression problem where our target at a given hotspot is for each species, the number of reports reporting that species at that hotspot over the total number of complete checklists at the hotspot, if that makes sense. Why are we looking at encounter rates? Well, first of all, it's an important quantity in ecology. Then it also enables us to kind of mitigate the fact that in some places you might have 200 checklists, and in some places you might have 10. But at least, if you take an average over the number of checklists that are present at each hotspot, then this effect of like the importance of the hotspot kind of goes away. And encounter rates are, also important just in eBird, because they are used in this form of bar chart that you can see on the right. And those bar charts are used in the eBird application to suggest species that you might see, like if you go to a certain place. So this is just based on like historical observations, and then it will just suggest, what species are most likely to be found. Now, this tool only relies on past data. So if you go to a location where no one has been before, you won't have any suggestion to help your birding. And these are also not modeled jointly. So it's just like modeling a single species at once. So this is why we wanted to create this data set for joint species distribution modeling. And we called it SatBird because we're looking at birds with satellite imageries, and nothing very original here. So I'm going to now move on to presenting the data set that we created for this task of predicting bird species encounter rates jointly using satellite images. So one thing that you might, ask is, birds migrate. So how do we deal with like the temporal aspect? So we did it in a very simple way. So first, we decided to focus on the US because that's the kind of best use case scenario where you have most data in eBird. But we wanted to account for migration, so we created like two subsets. One that corresponds to checklists that were reported in the summer, and then one for checklists that were reported in the winter. And with that, it corresponds to breeding and non-breeding season. Now, we were also interested in seeing what happens in the case where we don't have that much data. And so we also created a data set for Kenya, which is a very biodiverse region, but for which there are very few observations. And for each hotspot, we extracted the following information. So first, all the complete checklists that were reported at that hotspot between 2010 and 2023. And we aggregated those checklists to obtain the encounter rates in the way that I showed before. And so for the US, we looked at 670 species, and for Kenya, there were actually 1,054. And in the US, we decided to only keep hotspots with more than 5 complete checklists. So that seems like a low threshold, but it's still better than just having one checklist, because you would just have a 1-0 encounter rate, which is not really representative of what you might find there. Additionally, we also extracted range maps, which are available in eBird not for all species, but for certain species. And so with range maps, actually, we were able to correct for kind of anomalies in the data set. So sometimes in observations, there can be one year where there was really strong winds, and then a bird that is never supposed to be found in a certain region will be reported there. But obviously, that is not the distribution of birds. Like, this has nothing to do with what its habitat is. So we use like that range map information to kind of correct the targets. And so yeah, that was the eBird data side. But then for the input data to our models, the things that we're predicting the encounter rates from, we extracted satellite data, so the RGB and near-infrared reflectance information at 10-meter resolution from Sentinel-2, and we only kept the most recent, least cloudy image for each season that we considered. One thing that I should mention is that we chose to look at regions that were 640 square meters centered on the hotspot of interest. This is a bit of like trial and error, but also arbitrary. To be very honest, we could have chosen 500 square meters or something else. Well, it was just like it was just 10-meter resolution, and then computer scientists really like powers of 2, so 64 by 64 seemed like a nice size for a patch centered on the hotspot. And additionally, we also use environmental data that is traditionally used in species distribution models. So those are bioclimatic data that correspond to things like temperature and precipitation, which is available at 1 kilometer resolution in WorldClim. And we also used pedological data, which corresponds to soil data. It has like information about pH in the soil, carbon content, and so on. And this is available at 250-meter resolution, so much coarser than the satellite images. It's also, I should mention, it's also not available everywhere, and we just did, traditional mean imputation for the values that we're missing. And so to summarize, we have a lot of hotspots in the US. Well, a lot of them in the summer, fewer observations in the winter. And yeah, so soil data was not available for Kenya, and range maps were only available for certain species in the US, not all the species that we considered. One important thing when you look at geographical, like data that is distributed geographically, is how you do your data set split. Because you want to reduce spatial autocorrelation, which basically means that if you train a model on like if there are 2 locations in your train set, and then you have a validation location in between, maybe your and the locations are very close to each other, well, maybe your model could just like interpolate things and like have very good performance. But this is actually not the not representative of what your model performance would actually be if you go to a place where you have no data, because that is actually the use case that we're looking at. So we clustered locations by distance to each other, and then we assigned the clusters randomly to train, validation, and test. And so here on those maps, you can see what the distribution of our hotspots are. And yeah, as you can see in Kenya, it's like very, very sparse. Okay, so to summarize, what we do with SatBird is we have as input, any combination of satellite imagery and environmental data that we align, and we align the resolutions of all of those, and from that we want to predict the encounter rates for, in the US, for example, 670 species at once. And well, it is a supervised problem because we have access to the target encounter rates from the eBird checklist. And additionally, we use the range maps when they're available to correct the targets beforehand. Okay, I'm gonna move on a bit faster on the benchmark part. So we compare like different methods on this data set. First of all, looking at very classic regression methods. So, the baseline of the baseline is just looking at what is the mean encounter rates for like all species for each species in my training set, and yeah, that is the baseline where, well, it's not supposed to perform very well, and it doesn't really, but it's a very simple proxy. But more interestingly, so we looked at models that only use environmental data as input, and so like methods in ecology, like usually some of them used gradient boosted trees regression, so that's what we did here. And additionally, we also looked at this method called mosaics, where the idea is to basically draw fixed like extract features from satellite images, but those are not learned. They're kind of like you take a fixed sample of patches of satellite imagery, and then you do the same like convolution operations over each image in your data set, and then you get like some features from those satellite images, which you can concatenate with environmental variables, and then you actually train a model on those. But there is like no process of actual learning of the image features. We also tried to use pre-trained transformer models that have been used on satellite imagery, so SatMe and SatLAS, and then we also tried convolutional neural networks. So in our case, ResNet-18, taking as input combinations of like images, environmental variable, or like the reflectance data and the environmental variables. As for the evaluation, so as I mentioned, this is a regression task because we're predicting the encounter rates of the species. Like we have the direct probability as being our target. So you have like all those traditional regression metrics like mean squared error and mean absolute error. But one thing that we noticed is that in our data set, there are never 670 species present at the same time in a given location. So in your target, a given hotspot, like you actually have a lot of zeros. And so a model that that would predict like almost zero everywhere would actually seem to have okay regression metrics with mean squared error and mean absolute error. So instead, we kind of looked at ranking metrics, and the one that we were particularly interested in is what we call the adaptive top K accuracy. So it's basically saying if I have in my ground truth 5 species, then I'm going to look at the 5 top species that are predicted by my model, and then I'm going to see how many of those are actually present in the ground truth. And so we did the same, like looking at top 10 accuracy and top 30 accuracy, but the adaptive top K is more interesting because in some locations, actually, you might not even have 30 species.
A question?
Yes.
What's adaptive with the adaptive top K?
It's adaptive because it's just, well, maybe that could have been called like location-specific top K accuracy, but it's just like for each location, it's gonna be whatever number of species are present in the ground.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, we can look quickly at the results. So okay, I'm finding this is not the best way to parse information, but basically what we found is that if you use environmental data only, like the model that is just a gradient boosted trees on the environmental data, it performs better than for example, the ResNet trained just on the satellite imagery. So this goes to say that there is actually a lot of information that is already present in the environmental data, which is, also why things work quite well, like with traditional methods in ecology. Like they don't perform like so poorly. But when we actually add satellite imagery to the environmental data, so in our model, this is stacking the satellite imagery with the environmental rasters as input, then we get performance that is better than models that use satellite imagery only or environmental data only on all the metrics that we considered, which goes to say that there is some complementarity between environmental data and satellite imagery. So yeah, satellite imagery is not going to replace like the traditional things that are used like precipitation, temperature, because they are actually really good indicators of whether a species can develop in a certain environment. But satellite imagery really adds something to it. So yeah, if we go back to the table, yeah, that's the environmental baseline, is pretty good. But then if you add satellite imagery on top of the environmental variable, then you get a boost in performance. Okay, yeah, so we found this, yeah, I showed this table for the US summer dataset, which is where we have most data. But we have like similar findings for the US winter dataset and for Kenya. Now, in Kenya, the performance is just like poor overall, and that is, I think, well, due to two things. Um, at least, first of all, well, because we had so little data, we did not put any threshold on the number of checklists that had to be there at a given hotspot. And so, we run into this problem that you highlighted, Olaf, which is that if you just have one checklist, then you're just going to have ones and zeros to predict, but that doesn't really tell you whether a species is really absent or not. Like, you're just relying on one data point. And well, secondly, data is just scarcer. So I think there are methods to be developed for cases like this that should be like different than what we're trying to do here. And more qualitatively, I just want to show this sample prediction of our model. So this is in California. And what is interesting is that the model is able to pick up species that are fairly rare with restricted habitats like the verdin. So the table on the left is the top 10 predicted species of our model, and then the one on the on the right is like the top 10 ground truth species ranked in terms of encounter rates. And so the verdin is predicted in both of them as like with quite as with the highest encounter rates. And this was like a really nice thing to observe in our models, that it was able to predict things that are fairly rare, and there are not just mourning doves that are found everywhere. I mean, it does also predict mourning dove, but yeah, that was interesting. So to summarize on this project, so SADBIRD is a data set and benchmark for joint bird species distribution modeling, and our benchmark actually showed the complementarity of remote sensing and environmental data sources for species distribution modeling. And in this case, there are a lot of open questions that remain, because obviously, this is data set and benchmark, and so the goal is that more people after will use it. And some questions that I still have are, how do we choose a relevant spatial scale? So as I mentioned, we kind of semi-arbitrarily chose 640 square meters. I mean, there were some reasons behind it, but it could be anything else. And actually, for some species, you might need a different spatial scale than for others. So that would be an interesting thing to think about in the future. And the other thing is, how can we build like temporal species distribution modeling? Because we considered seasons as being like completely different tasks, but is there like some kind of way to inject temporal information and kind of have models that can model multiple seasons at once? Is that useful? Well, that's something to explore. And the one other question is, how might we actually quantify the uncertainty of the model, which is also linked to how many checklists you have available at a given hotspot. So yeah, I want to acknowledge like all the contributions, my wonderful collaborators on this project, Amna, Benjamin, Hager, and then my supervisors, Joshua, Hugo, and David. So you can find like more information about this project at sadbird.github.io, and the dataset is there, the paper is there, and I guess my contact is also there for after sales service, as any dataset should have. Okay, so I have a bit of time to talk about another project that we've been working on. So with SADBIRD, the problem that we try to look at is, how do you get information about species distribution in places where you have zero information? And you can use satellite images because that's at least available everywhere. Now, another case that you might run into in real life is, well, when you go out on the field, you might not observe like every species, but species interact. So sometimes, you will see a certain plant and then you might think, oh, I know that this butterfly likes this flower. So perhaps, this is a good place for this butterfly to be. So we looked at this problem of predicting species occurrence patterns from partial observations, being motivated by the fact that we were using citizen science data with eBird, and then we tried to think, okay, how would we go about extending this framework to other citizen science databases? And then we realized, oh, a lot of citizen science databases focus on different taxa, but they don't have nearly as much data as eBird does, because people love birds and they're just very charismatic. So you just have more data for birds than for other other species on Earth. So the question here was, how can we, leverage any available presence-absence species information to fill data gaps? In particular, looking at the use case of birds and butterflies, because birds are predators to, some birds are predators to some butterflies. So if you know that certain bird species is there, that might be informative to know what kind of butterfly is there, or vice versa. And there is this nice citizen science database, which is called eBirdified, which was modeled after eBird. So the data is like in the same format. We also have these complete checklists, so it's it works well together. But if you go to a specific location, in some cases you might just have eBird data, in some places you might just have eBirdified data, and in some places you might have both. So the idea here was, okay, how do we actually use the information when we have both of them, to kind of inject that in modeling the butterflies or the birds when we just have partial information. So in this work, we looked at two tasks. So I mentioned trying to predict birds from butterfly species and vice versa, and that's and for that we created a data set in the same way as for SatBird, which just called it SatButterfly. And then we looked at another kind of task within just the SatBird data set by splitting the bird species into songbirds and non-songbirds. And so we came up with this adaptation of a model called CTRAN from this paper called General Multi-Label Image Classification with Transformers from Jacques Lachantin. And the idea with CTRAN is that, you have access to certain labels at training time, and you want to make use of them. So typically, in our case, so when we adapted it, we still have as input, our satellite image and the environmental data, and then we can still, encode our images with ResNet 18, which is what we did before. So you have a kind of image encoding, but then we use these embeddings that they have in CTRAN, which are basically saying for the set of species that you're considering, they can be, their state can be known or unknown. So it's and known can be either present or absent, or unknown. So typically if I go to a place and I just have bird data, then the bird data is known, the butterfly data is unknown, and what I want to predict is the butterfly data. And so this is trained in a way that actually masks species during training time and try to predict the species that are masked as unknown. And we compared this method with other methods that also, make use of partial information, such as feedback prop, which is basically this method that, you have your already trained model, and then at test time, you say, okay, for example, I have information about the bird species, and so I would just back propagate this bird species a little, a few times to improve the prediction of the butterflies, even though I don't have those labels. And so what we find is that this method of like, masking species during training and then trying to predict species that are marked as unknown, but for which, well, during training we actually have ground truth information. We find that this like outperforms other methods for predicting birds given butterflies data, and it performs like comparably to other methods for predicting butterflies from birds data. Okay, I will keep time for questions on this, but I just want to end this talk with some perspectives that on machine learning for biodiversity. So so we looked at like different ways of how we can start tackling this problem of filling the gaps in biodiversity data. But it is really important to just value the work that goes into data collection and data annotation. That is usually not what machine learning people do, because we just get data from people. And yeah, I call this like perspectives, but obviously I don't have authority over anything. I just have like personal experience that I can share. And I don't know if any of you is a machine learning scientist specifically, but I really believe that when we work on applications for biodiversity, it's really important, if we can, to actually go on the field, because there's so much that happens there that you will never realize if you just receive the data from downloading it from a server. So well, with this eBird and Sadbird and Sadbirdfly project, I did not, well, I guess some of my checklists might have ended up in the training set, but like, I mean, this is like citizen science, so I, I didn't have to go in the field, but I have another project like for tree monitoring, for which I get data about like tree measurements. And I think there are a lot of things that I would never have realized if I had not been on the field. Well, first of all, how difficult it is to get data, which actually makes you more motivated about developing methods that can automate, predicting the height of trees, for example, because it's quite tedious to measure. But most of all, because I mean, gathering data is just hard, and sometimes I think we often come across this commentary on, oh, we just need like more data. But no, actually, sometimes the data is just hard to get, and like you can't have more. So we should like develop methods that don't work like because oh, if you have more data, your model was like if you scale, then things will work. No, that's not how we should view things. We should like be a bit more like conscious about the effort that goes into data collection, and not view this as like solutionism of, okay, no, we just need like more annotation and we just need more data and then our model is going to work. Like we should adapt our model to the data that we actually have accessible. So yeah, that's about it. I'm gonna keep some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mélisande. And while the rest of you think of your questions, I'll start with some of my own. So I like that you bring up the perspectives on machine learning for biodiversity. I think applies to many different application areas for machine learning. We computer scientists, we really don't want to get our hands too dirty with regards to this, or we consider ourselves not being experts enough for that. But I think you can turn it around as well, because we can learn a lot from the process, and we can also use our knowledge in the process. So I think it's a two-way street where we need to work with this. We need to get our hands dirty with this, and we need to also invent the sort of the language to speak about the data collection. I don't know. I don't have a question here. I just like that you bring this up.
I think it's I mean, some things that I've come across, and I'm certainly sometimes guilty of that, is that I think well, I say we, but at least I sometimes don't spend enough time just looking at my data. Um, sometimes there's always the thing of, oh, like, let's just try this, throw this method and see if it works, when, you could just be like, no, in this case, like, I don't necessarily want something that is just generalizable across like 10,000 different tasks. I'm just like looking at a specific problem. And so it's okay to tailor my model just for that, but I need to understand, what is in my data? Like, what are the biases in it? What are, how is it collected? In which environments? Yeah. So, I mean, that was like something I've come across more in like when working with passive acoustic monitoring data, because then you have different kinds of ambient sounds in the background.
Yeah, yeah. I think Neil Lawrence work on data readiness levels
Mm.
are things that teach you a lot on this as well. Um, could you imagine in the work you presented, could you imagine sort of developing the data? Could you imagine other kinds of sources or features that could be added to these data sets that could be beneficial?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question, um, because with this work, I th like now we're almost a year in after Sad Bird was released, and so um, I can see that definitely that the impact that I have is not. I mean, there is some impact in the ecology community, but it's not like direct in the sense that they're not using, this data set or like the methods, because they have their own data sets that they're looking at. But in the machine learning community, it has like yeah, some people like got interested in this problem of species distribution modeling, and so I've seen recently some works about kind of crossing textual information about like habitats descriptions and so on with bird species observations and like satellite imagery. I think that's quite interesting. I Yeah, I don't know how that would work exactly yet, but one thing I'm actually interested in is looking at, can we, cross acoustic data with, satellite imagery and like all our citizen science data. So yeah, it's always the question of, where you have the data, does that actually bring any complementarity and so on. Um, but I think that there's some potential there. I just haven't fully formulated it for myself.
Yeah, there was some work on sort of the collecting a data set for the multimodal task that you're talking
Mhm.
about. I don't remember, was it called sort of Sounding Earth or something?
Mm.
Uh, I think they used uh, imagery from Google and then citizen science observations of sort of sound recordings.
Mm.
Do you have some more questions from Mélisande?
Yeah, hello. Hi. Very nice presentation. And I was thinking, you mentioned that your dataset, this benchmark, Sadbird, it's been online for like, I guess, a year or something now.
Mhm.
And have you already seen interesting other research groups that have done something which improved upon what you did in your own release of the dataset or something like that?
Mhm. So not like, well, I've been talking to a few people like who have been using this data set. I just don't know if like their work is out yet. But like the thing is, I feel that where I see Sadbird is like being most impactful is like not necessarily, for the task of SATBIRD itself, because, you can view this as, okay, this is quite specific to look at bird species encounter rates in a case where we have like presence absence data, and like, it's all like these constructions that if any ecologist, has their own data set, it might not fit this framework. But I've seen like people use it as a downstream task to kind of try to find train models to create good embeddings of what like ecosystems are from like different sorts of data, so environmental data, richer like satellite image data that I used, and then try to like transfer that to the SATBIRD task as a downstream task. So I have to say I think the point with SATBIRD was not, to have people actually, fight to get the best metrics on this task, because, as any machine learning task, then you try to bring it into the real world and you're like, oh, they have their own limitations. But at least, it gets people going to work on those kinds of topics.
Yeah, that makes sense. And another question that I have is, have you thought about species distribution modeling for like marine ecosystems or oceans or stuff? I would imagine it's quite different to model fish behaviors and stuff compared to birds, for example.
Yeah, I think it's I think there's work on, there's quite a lot of I mean, a lot is like all relative, I guess, in the ecosystem of machine learning. But I've seen like a few works on monitoring like marine mammals, but with bioacoustics data. I guess that's a bit more promising than just sending people out to dive and and take pictures and report marine mammals. I guess the data would be very different. I haven't looked at this like more in detail.
That makes sense. Thanks a lot.
Hello.
Right.
I think I missed the first part when you talked about environmental data. Like, what kind of parameters does it contain?
Okay, so it has. Do I have a slide up for this? Wait a second. Oops. Let me try and see if I have one extra. Okay. Does this work? Okay, yeah. So those are the environmental variables that we use. They're basically from this database called WorkClim for the bioclimatic data. So, you have like mean temperature and max temperature of the warmest month. So those are things that, seem like very, I don't know, very coarse in some sense. Mostly like temperature and precipitation data. But that's what people use in ecology, and it already gives a lot of information. And for the soil data, these are things like soil organic carbon content and like sand mass, and that might be informative.
Yeah, so because I was surprised to see that it is quite coarse. I mean, I'm from this weather and climate background, so I could think of other data sets which are more, for example, reanalysis data, which are more finer. And I was also wondering, like, would air quality, like particulate matter would play a role, but maybe people have already thought about this.
Actually, I think you'd be surprised in how much there is still to do in species distribution modeling. I think there is still, like, those are basically the kind of variables that people use in ecology usually, because like that kind of has a link to the species distribution. But I think there would definitely be potential to add more information. I think there are more like complex variables that are sometimes taken into account. But I remember I had a chat with like an ecologist who was saying, oh, like pollution, for example, pollution data, they don't include them in their models because they don't really know what effect it has. Like it hasn't, really been studied when, you could think, oh, but pollution data should be important. Um, so yeah, maybe that's something to try.
Yeah, thank you.
Is some form of altitude or GPS location, is that included?
Yeah, so I think yes, you can include altitude. I think that um, that helps. I remember. So I think in our case, like we try to include altitude, but then didn't really make much of a difference with using the satellite imagery, maybe because you have like other kinds of information that is correlated with altitude that you have in the satellite imagery. Um,
Surprisingly, there is no wind data, which is usually the go-to weather data.
yeah. I think, I mean, the wind data, probably if you have the wind data, then it's maybe like that's the moment where you should also think about the temporal aspect of your species distribution model. Um,
Yeah,
and
but
hopefully,
you can have, places which are really, windy, stormy, which
mm,
could expect like, birds won't like it to have a nest over there.
mm.
Uh, yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, like there are tons of tons of things to be done in this space for sure. Yeah.
Mhm. But of course, this is very amateur opinion. Yeah.
No, I mean, I do believe that there is a lot to do. Like sometimes I'm I'm kind of surprised. I'm like, oh, wait, people still do this. Well, it seems to work pretty okay, but but it really feels like we could improve the methods.
All right. Thank you very much for this, Mélisande. It's
Thank you
been
so much.
great hearing about your work. Um, Welcome back next week, everybody. We'll have Charlie Fiesler who's a postdoc at University of Vienna, and he's going to talk about something no less than how to build a brain. So I'm really looking forward to this. Do we have Charlie in the audience now? I cannot hear you, Charlie. I think you're unmuted, but I cannot hear you. Oh well, I guess we'll learn more about that in a week. So thank you all for today, and especially you, Marisol.
Oh, thank you so much.